I never thought it would come to this. After all these years, my son is asking me to move into a nursing home. But then again, I guess I should have seen it coming. Margaret sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, but it did little to warm the chill that had settled in her chest. Her son, Andrew, had just dropped the bombshell, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "Mom, we think it's time you went to a nursing home." He'd said it with such ease, as if it were no more than a casual suggestion, as if it were as simple as asking her to move a piece of furniture. She had always known that things were changing, that her age was starting to show in the creases of her skin and the ache in her joints. But this felt like a betrayal. Margaret had spent years raising Andrew, sacrificing her time, her energy, her youth. And now, it seemed, he was throwing her away. She swallowed the lump in her throat, fighting back the wave of tears that threatened to overwhelm her. "I understand," she replied, her voice steady, though the weight of the words pressed down on her like 1,000 pounds. She had no idea how she'd managed to keep her composure in that moment. Maybe it was the years of practice, of holding things in, of pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. She had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together for everyone else. But now, in the silence that followed, she realized she had been forgotten. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. Andrew and his wife, Lisa, had always been distant, but this felt different. They didn't want her around anymore. She wasn't needed. She wasn't even wanted. Margaret didn't say anything else. She simply nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her cup. She had been here before, in moments of hurt, in moments of loss. She had learned to hide her emotions, to swallow the pain and keep moving forward. But this was different. This was her own flesh and blood, the one person she had trusted more than anyone else, asking her to leave. And, though she didn't say it out loud, a small voice inside her whispered, "This is just the beginning." She walked slowly to the window, looking out at the familiar yard, at the flowers she had planted with her late husband. Everything felt different now, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Her whole life had been a series of sacrifices for others, and now it seemed like those sacrifices meant nothing. Andrew and Lisa's lives were moving on without her. She was a burden, something to be discarded. Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself. 3 weeks. That's all it had taken for her to decide what she would do next. 3 weeks to plan, to prepare. She knew that nothing would ever be the same again. And as she turned away from the window, a quiet resolve settled over her. She wasn't going to just sit back and let them push her aside. She wasn't going to let them win. Margaret sat in the quiet of her living room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the empty space before her. 3 weeks had passed since that moment, since Andrew's words had cut through her like a blade. She had spent that time in silence, reflecting on everything that had led up to this point. Her mind raced through the years of sacrifices, the nights she had stayed awake worrying about her son, the moments she had put herself last to make sure Andrew had everything he needed. And now, just like that, she was supposed to pack up and leave the only home she had ever known. But Margaret wasn't going to let that happen. She had made up her mind. The plan had already started to take shape in her mind. The very idea that her own son, the person she had raised with love and care, could ask her to leave without a second thought was something she couldn't just ignore. She wasn't going to cry about it, though. Margaret was no stranger to pain. Life had taught her how to hold things in, how to wear a mask of calmness even when her heart was breaking. But this was different. Her son was making decisions about her life, about her future, without even consulting her. That's what hurt the most. The silence in the house seemed to grow louder each day, suffocating her. She walked to the kitchen and began preparing dinner, her movements slow and deliberate. The kitchen was the heart of the home, the place where she had spent countless hours cooking meals for her family. But now, as she chopped vegetables and set the table, she couldn't help but feel the emptiness of it all. Andrew and Lisa had grown distant over the years. But it wasn't until recently that she noticed just how far apart they had become from her. The small things she used to take for granted, the phone calls, the visits, the dinners together, had all stopped. She was no longer part of their world, and it hurt more than she could put into words. It wasn't just Andrew's words that stung, though. It was the realization that, after everything she had done for them, she was now a burden. She was being pushed aside, forgotten. The smell of the meal filled the room, but it did nothing to fill the hollow space in her heart. Margaret set the table for one. Her mind wandered to the times when the family would gather around the table, laughter echoing in the walls, everyone sharing stories about their day. Those moments felt like they belonged to another lifetime now. Margaret sighed and sat down at the table. She picked up her fork, poking at the food on her plate, but she wasn't hungry. It wasn't the food she wanted. It wasn't the house or the comfort of her surroundings. What she wanted was to feel needed again, to feel like she wasn't invisible. But she knew that wasn't going to happen if she stayed in this house any longer. 3 weeks had given her time to think. Time to understand that this was the moment that would define the rest of her life. She couldn't let Andrew and Lisa push her out. She wasn't ready to give up just yet. Margaret stood up from the table, her hands gripping the back of the chair. She had made up her mind. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. 3 weeks had passed, but Margaret still couldn't shake the feeling of being pushed aside. It wasn't just about the words Andrew had said to her. It wasn't just about Lisa's cold indifference. It was everything. The way they had begun to treat her. As though she were a burden rather than a part of the family. The emptiness of the house felt like a weight on her chest every time she walked through the door. The sound of her own footsteps echoed through the halls, a constant reminder of the silence that had taken over. Margaret had always been strong, always the one to hold everything together. She had raised Andrew on her own, sacrificed her own dreams and aspirations to make sure he had everything he needed. She had done it all without complaint. But now, as she sat alone in the living room, the weight of her years of sacrifice felt like a heavy chain around her ankles. She had spent countless hours worrying about Andrew, about his future, about his happiness. But now, it seemed, he was more concerned about his own life than hers. Margaret looked around the room, taking in the familiar surroundings. This had been her home for so many years. She had built it with her husband, the man she had loved for decades. And yet now, it felt as though it was no longer hers. She was just a visitor in her own life, waiting for the day when she would be asked to leave for good. Margaret thought back to the days when the family had been whole. When Andrew was a child, when they would sit around the dinner table together, laughing and talking about their day. She missed those days. She missed the sound of Andrew's voice, the way he used to look at her with love and appreciation. But now, all that seemed so far away. She hadn't even realized how much she missed those moments until they were gone. The quiet of the house was suffocating, and she couldn't help but feel like she had been abandoned. She was no longer needed, no longer wanted. Andrew had moved on, and Lisa had always been distant, but now it was as if they were both pretending she didn't exist. Margaret wasn't going to let them win, though. She couldn't. She had spent her whole life fighting for her family, for the people she loved. And now, it was her turn to fight for herself. Margaret stood up from the couch, determination settling in her bones. She wasn't going to just sit here and let them take everything from her. She wasn't going to let them make her feel small, like she didn't matter. No, she was going to take control. She walked over to the phone and picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the number she had written down 3 weeks ago. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, and Margaret's heart beat a little faster as she spoke. She had already made up her mind. It was time to take back her life. She was done being the one who always gave. She was ready to make a change. The phone call had ended, and Margaret felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over her. She hadn't expected things to unfold this way. She had prepared herself for the worst, but now that she had taken the first step, there was a strange sense of calm that she couldn't explain. It was as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. Margaret had spent so long thinking about how her family had changed, how Andrew and Lisa had turned their backs on her. She had been so focused on the hurt, on the betrayal, that she hadn't seen the possibilities before her. But now, things were different. She was no longer just a passive observer in her own life. She had a plan, and for once, it wasn't about what Andrew or Lisa wanted. It was about what she needed. The next morning, Margaret woke up early, the soft light of dawn spilling into the room. The house was still, the silence almost comforting in its familiarity. She made her way to the kitchen, her hands moving with practiced ease as she prepared breakfast. As she set the table for one, the sound of the coffee brewing was the only noise that filled the space. Margaret sat down, looking around the room, and for a moment she could almost see the past playing out in front of her. She saw Andrew, a little boy, running into the kitchen to give her a hug before school. She saw the family dinners they used to have, where laughter filled the air, and they were all together, united. But now, those days felt like a distant memory. Margaret took a deep breath, letting the memories wash over her. She had raised Andrew with everything she had, and yet here she was, alone in the very house they had built together. The thought stung, but it didn't break her. It only made her stronger. She wasn't going to let them take this from her. She wasn't going to let them push her out of her own home, out of her own life. After breakfast, Margaret went to her room and pulled out the old suitcase she had tucked away in the back of her closet. She hadn't used it in years, but today, it was exactly what she needed. She began to pack, carefully folding her clothes and placing them inside, each item representing a small act of rebellion. She wasn't leaving because she was weak or helpless. She was leaving because she had finally realized that her worth wasn't tied to Andrew or Lisa's approval. Her worth came from within. It wasn't about their house, their money, or their plans for her future. It was about her own strength, her own resilience. As she zipped up the suitcase, Margaret took one last look around the room. This was where her life had been, where she had raised her family, where she had loved and lost. But it was time to move forward. She wasn't going to let them decide her fate. She was the one in control now. Margaret picked up the suitcase and made her way to the door, her steps steady and sure. She didn't look back. She knew that whatever came next, she could handle it. She had lived through much worse, and she wasn't about to stop now. She had a life to live, and it was hers to create. Margaret arrived at the small apartment she had rented, the one she had found just a few days ago. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was a fresh start. The apartment was modest, with plain white walls and a few pieces of furniture. But as she stepped inside, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't suffocating in the silence of her old house. Here, she could breathe. She set her suitcase down on the floor and took a moment to look around. The space was small, but it had the warmth of a place that could become home. The kitchen, although basic, was functional. The living room had a single armchair and a coffee table. The bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a bed that looked inviting after the long drive. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft quilt that covered it. It wasn't the grand master bedroom she had once shared with her late husband, Noel, but it would do. She was starting over, and that was what mattered. She had made her decision, and now, it was time to live it. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. It was a text from Andrew. Mom, we need to talk. Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the reply button. She thought about responding, but something stopped her. She had said everything she needed to say. Her silence now was her answer. She wasn't going to beg for their attention anymore. She wasn't going to chase after the approval that had been so easily given away in the past. She wasn't that woman anymore. Margaret stood up, her legs steady beneath her, and walked to the small window. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a soft, golden glow over the street below. It was quiet, peaceful. She could hear the faint sounds of the city, cars passing by, distant conversations, the hum of life moving on. And she realized something. She had spent so many years waiting for other people to make decisions for her, waiting for Andrew and Lisa to decide what was best for her. But now, she was free. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need to live by their rules anymore. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a sense of control over her life. She was finally able to make her own choices, and that felt like a victory. She wasn't going to let the past define her. She wasn't going to be the person they thought she was. No, Margaret was stronger than that. She had proven it to herself. The next morning, as Margaret sipped her coffee and looked out the window, she smiled. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. She had walked away from the life she knew, from the people who had hurt her, and she was going to be okay. It wouldn't be easy. She knew that. But she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, each one blending into the next as Margaret settled into her new life. The apartment, although small, was beginning to feel like home. She spent her mornings sipping coffee by the window, watching the world outside go by, and her afternoons exploring the neighborhood. She found solace in the simple things: the scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the street, the sound of birds chirping in the trees, the way the sunlight filtered through the curtains in the afternoon. Life felt different here. It felt like she could breathe. But even in this new chapter, the weight of the past lingered. Margaret couldn't forget what had happened, couldn't shake the way Andrew's words had felt. Asterisk. We think it's time you went to a nursing home. Asterisk, they echoed in her mind, playing on repeat whenever she allowed herself to think about it. At times, it felt like a distant memory, a chapter in a book she had closed. But other times, it felt fresh, like a wound that had only just been inflicted. Margaret knew she couldn't escape the past entirely. She had spent decades living for others, for her family, and now that she had taken the first step toward independence, she found herself struggling to let go of the guilt. Did I do the right thing? She asked herself often. But when she looked at her new surroundings, when she thought about the peace she had found here, she knew she had made the right choice. It wasn't just about escaping the coldness of her old home. It was about reclaiming her life, about standing up for herself in a way she never had before. One afternoon, Margaret received a phone call. It was from Andrew. She had expected it, but hearing his voice again after everything that had happened still stirred something inside her. Mom! Andrew's voice crackled through the line. We need to talk. I've been thinking about everything. Margaret listened in silence as he went on, explaining how Lisa had felt guilty about the way they had treated her. How they had thought she needed care, but now they realized they had been wrong. It sounded rehearsed, and for a moment, Margaret wondered if this was just another attempt to manipulate her, to get her to come back. But she stayed quiet, letting him talk, letting him believe that his words were reaching her. When he finished, there was a long pause. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. I've made my decision, Andrew, she finally said, her voice calm and steady. I'm not coming back. I'm fine here. I'm taking care of myself. The words felt strange as they left her mouth, but they also felt right. For so long, she had put everyone else's needs before her own, but now, for the first time in years, she was putting herself first. She wasn't going to apologize for it. I understand, Andrew said, his voice sounding distant, almost resigned. Margaret knew that he hadn't expected her to react this way, but it didn't matter. She wasn't going to play the role of the victim anymore. She wasn't going to be the one begging for love or attention. She was going to live her life on her own terms. Goodbye, Andrew, she said softly, and before he could say another word, she hung up the phone. She sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. For a fleeting second, she felt a pang of sadness. But it was quickly replaced by something else, something stronger. Margaret had finally done it. She had stood up for herself. And now, she was free. Margaret sat in the small armchair by the window, the warm afternoon sun casting a soft glow across the room. It had been a few days since her conversation with Andrew, and the silence in the apartment was now something she had grown accustomed to. For years, the noise and constant movement of family had filled every corner of her home, but now there was a different kind of peace. She wasn't sure if she would ever fully get used to the quiet, but it felt like freedom. As she sat there, her mind wandered back to the past. The memories of raising Andrew, of the sacrifices she had made, of the love she had given so freely. It all seemed so distant now, like a story she had read long ago. But even as she thought about the past, she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't go back. The life she had once known. Of her past. She was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't going to waste another minute wondering if she had made the right choice. She had. And that was all that mattered. Weeks passed, and Margaret continued to settle into her new routine. She had made peace with the fact that her old life was over, but something inside her had begun to shift. She was starting to see that her worth wasn't defined by the people around her, by Andrew or Lisa, or even by the years she had spent caring for them. She was beginning to understand that her life could be something more than the roles she had always played. She had started taking small steps to rediscover herself, to find out who Margaret really was beyond the labels of mother, wife, and caregiver. One of those steps was enrolling in a painting class at the community center. She had always loved art, but it was something she had pushed aside when she had to focus on raising Andrew. Now, with time on her hands and a fresh perspective, she decided it was time to reconnect with that part of herself. The first class was intimidating. She had spent so many years in the background, not standing out, not doing things just for her. But as the brush stroked the canvas, something unexpected happened. She found herself lost in the colors, in the blending of shades, in the feeling of creating something from nothing. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a sense of joy, a sense of ownership over her own life. It was simple, but it was enough. After the class, Margaret walked home through the park, the evening air cool and crisp against her skin. She looked up at the sky, the colors of the sunset painting a soft canvas across the horizon. She felt alive, like she was finally waking up. The weight of the past, the guilt, the hurt, it all seemed to fade into the distance. It didn't disappear completely, but it didn't have a hold on her anymore. She had let go. As she entered her apartment, Margaret felt a warmth in her chest, a quiet sense of contentment. The phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. Margaret hesitated before picking it up, knowing it was probably Andrew or Lisa, but she didn't let that stop her. The message was from Andrew. Asterisk. Mom, I know we haven't talked in a while, but I've been thinking about everything. I realize now that I've been wrong, and I'm sorry. I hope we can talk soon. Asterisk. Margaret stared at the screen for a moment, the words weighing heavily in her hands. She didn't feel the rush to respond like she used to. She didn't feel the need to explain herself or make them understand. She had already made her decision. Her life was hers now. Margaret set the phone down, feeling a calmness wash over her. She wasn't angry at Andrew. She wasn't even upset anymore. She had made peace with the fact that some things were out of her control. All she could do was live her life in a way that felt true to herself. And that, in itself, was enough. Margaret walked to the window and gazed out at the city, the lights flickering in the distance. She knew she had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. Ready to live for herself, ready to find the pieces of herself she had lost. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be hers. Margaret woke up to the soft rays of morning light filtering through the window, the air fresh and crisp as autumn began to settle in. It had been a month since she had moved into the small apartment, a month since she had taken control of her own life again. Her mind had cleared, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. The phone had remained silent for days, and while there was a part of her that still expected messages from Andrew or Lisa, she had come to realize that her new life didn't need their approval or validation. Her life was her own now, and she had come to embrace that fact. Margaret spent the morning in the kitchen, brewing her coffee and organizing her small space. She had started to decorate, bringing in a few personal items that made the apartment feel more like her own home. framed pictures of places she had visited over the years, a vase of fresh flowers on the table, and a few books that had been collecting dust on her shelf for far too long. As she moved around the apartment, Margaret couldn't help but smile to herself. She had filled her days with small, meaningful things that brought her joy, not out of obligation, but because she simply enjoyed them. She was no longer the person who lived to please others. She was learning to please herself. The sound of her doorbell broke her thoughts, and she froze for a moment. She wasn't expecting anyone. But as the doorbell rang again, Margaret walked over to the door, her steps steady. She opened it slowly, and there stood Andrew. He looked different somehow. There was an unease about him, a nervousness that she hadn't seen before. He had always been so confident, so sure of himself. But now, as he stood before her, he seemed unsure of what to say. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, his voice tentative. Margaret stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of him. He was her son, and no matter what had happened between them, she still cared for him. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to open that door again. She had made her choice, and her choice was to move on. "I'm not sure what there is left to say, Andrew," Margaret replied, her voice calm but firm. She had been through enough, and she wasn't going to let his words pull her back into the past. "I'm not going back, and I don't think I ever will." Andrew looked at her, his expression filled with a mixture of regret and uncertainty. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said, about how I treated you. I was wrong, Mom. I should have never pushed you away like that. I'm sorry." Margaret felt a wave of emotion rush over her, but she didn't let it show. She had heard apologies before, and they didn't always change things. "I know you're sorry, Andrew," she said softly. "But apologies don't change the past. And I can't go back. I can't go back to the way things were." There was a long silence between them. Andrew seemed to understand, and for a moment, the walls between them seemed to dissolve. "I just want you to know," he said, "that I never meant to hurt you. I was just so caught up in my own life, in my own plans, that I didn't see what I was doing to you. But I get it now. I get it." Margaret nodded, her heart heavy but her resolve strong. "I hope you do, Andrew," she said quietly. "But this is my life now. I'm not going to let anyone take that from me." Andrew stood there for a moment longer, as if he was weighing his options, then finally nodded. "I'll let you be, Mom. But I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I don't expect things to be the same, but I hope we can figure something out, maybe someday." Margaret smiled faintly, but there was no trace of bitterness in her smile. "We'll see," she said. As he turned to leave, Margaret felt something shift inside her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt hopeful. She had made her choice, and no matter what came next, she knew she was going to be okay. She was finally in control of her own life, and nothing could take that away from her.